Thom Hartmann program.
Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. One of my very, very closest friends is a professor of neuroscience in Australia. In fact, he's been a guest on our program quite some time back. And my friend Richard recommended that I get in touch with Dr. Edwin C. May. He's a Ph.D. Nuclear physicist and the founder and director of the Laboratories for Fundamental Research. And what I learned blew my mind, and I wanted to reach out to Dr. May and say, hey, can we talk about this? I think this stuff is fascinating. It opens doors to conversations about the physical universe, about physics, about psychology and how we think and how our psychology affects, our understanding of reality itself, and to the possibility that there are senses that we haven't yet discovered, or even realms that we haven't discovered, much like back in the day, back 150 years ago, if you said to somebody, someday somebody 1,000 miles away from you will appear in your living room on a screen, 4 feet wide, and be able to have a conversation with you in real time, and they would have said, come on, you're crazy. You're crazy. That doesn't exist. Because what? Radio waves? What's that? So on the line with us is Dr. Edwin C. May. He is a Ph.D., founder, director of the Laboratories for Fundamental Research. LFR.org is the website. And Dr. May, first of all, welcome to the program. But secondly, tell us, for 20 years, you worked with and for the federal government. Tell us about that program.
Well, good morning, Thom. Thanks for having me on. You laid the groundwork beautifully, and I really appreciate it. Yes, it all started way back when, Doctor, I'm laying on my couch to tell you about all this, when a Soviet information scientist, Ippolit Moseyevich Kogan, an information guy, wrote a paper in 1969, I believe, claiming telepathy is possible. And he gave an explanation of how it worked. That really terrified the U.S. intelligence community at the moment. But in 1974, the CIA got very, very interested in this. If it were real, that's a big if, then they would it's obvious. If you could collect intelligence by just sitting in your living room and learning by some magical ESP way what's going on in Russia, that would be valuable. But they didn't believe that at first. So they initiated a program at what was then called Stanford Research Institute in Menlo Park, California. And my colleagues, Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ, started the program in 74. They had permission from the director of CIA at the time, a guy by the name of William Colby, to begin all this. And long story short, it appeared to be real, and they were really excited about it and used it throughout 20 years of that program, which is known popularly as the Stargate program, having nothing to do with that science fiction show.
So this was an actual program that was funded with U.S. government funding, that was overseen by the CIA, that hired these colleagues of yours and ultimately hired you too to do this 20-year investigation in the possibility that we could spy on the Russians using ESP, and you found that there was some evidence for it. How did it work? What were the protocols, and what did you all learn from this?
Well, one of the things we learned about it was that it was useful, and like other forms of humans gathering intelligence, back when they had spies on the ground sneaking around behind enemy lines in World War II, human gathering of intelligence, called HUMINT, is very unreliable. Did I count the number of tanks right, or did I miss 20 of them? That's kind of problem, right? And so the ESP portion of this was as good as human spies on the ground, and as bad as that. That doesn't mean it was not useful. So the way it worked, and the way it would work in a laboratory setting, is I have a collection of photographs, let's say, sitting on my desk here in California, and you're up in Oregon, and I randomly choose one of those pictures with a random system, and I say, "Hey, Thom, please tell me what's in your mind with regard to the picture I just chose." Now, I don't even know myself because it's just a number somewhere. And oddly enough, under laboratory detailed conditions, you are able to do that some of the time, way above chance. And that says, hey, something really interesting is going on, and it may inform us about how we can get information across space and time and what's going on in our brain when we are receiving that stuff.
Now, you are a physicist. Do I have that right?
Yes.
Can you, does this have to do with quantum entanglement, in your opinion?
Oh, my favorite unhappy question, no. And we don't think that quantum entanglement has anything to do with the brain, and there's lots of scientific papers on that, why that is not the case, although it's a popular idea, and as a metaphor, it's pretty cool. But there's no evidence of it that quantum entanglement, quantum mechanics, of course, involves how all the atoms work and all that down at the micro level. In our brains, most of them are full of atoms and their neurons and so on. So it is a quantum mechanical thing we have between our ears, but not the entanglement part of it.
Okay, and the entanglement being, you know, if you split a particle in two and one part goes flying off in one direction and the other particle goes off flying in the other direction, if you rotate the first particle, the second particle will instantaneously rotate identically, even though they might be separated by, you know, hundreds of billions of miles or trillions of miles, and they entangle at faster than the speed of light. Am I correctly describing quantum entanglement?
Close enough for government work, so to speak.
Right, okay.
The Chinese, yeah, go ahead.
Well, no, finish your thought.
Yeah, the Chinese have the all-time record of this. They were able to show entanglement over a few hundred kilometers by bouncing beams of light up into a satellite and back down again. That's the current record where entanglement works. And I want to tell you an idea about entanglement, and that has to do with quantum decoherence is a technical term, but I'll make it like this. Suppose you and I have children, and we are both our kids in the park, and we're side by side, and the kids are swinging back and forth, and those two kids are correlated. When you push your kid forward, my kid moves forward, and if you push your kid backwards and back, and so on. But then I carefully cut the swing in half, and take my swing and travel carefully to New York, and so you should know instantaneously that when your kid goes forward, my kid's going forward. There's a problem. Unknown to you, I took my kid out for a pizza. That's called environmental decoherence.
Aha. Okay. And so we don't think that this mechanism that seems to be extrasensory perception is based on in quantum physics. What is it based in?
Well, we're lazy. At least I'm lazy as a physicist. If I don't have to invent anything new, I'm not about to go ahead and do just that. So look at the normal sensory systems. If you're lying on your back on a nice cloudless evening and enjoying the stars above you, and all of a sudden you see a satellite go over it, your attention is drawn to something that's moving. And that's true with all our sensory systems. If you're at a party and somebody walks in with too much cologne or perfume, you know it immediately. But then after a while, you get used to it. The technical term is habituate to it. So we said, okay, if all of our sensory systems act that way, ESP, sensory, must also act that way. And yes, we found a way of showing that some things, when they're changing, are more likely to be seen, recognized, than things that are not. For example, suppose you're standing, 200,000 years ago on the edge of the savannah in Africa, and you glance over and you see you glance over and see the grass that's not moving, but you notice the leopard has changed.
Right. And this is this is wired into us. This is survival stuff. This is fascinating. Dr. Edwin C. May is with us. He's the founder and director of the Laboratories for Fundamental Research. LFR.org is the website. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. Senses are an interesting thing. Dr. Edwin C. May is with us. Dr. May, dogs their olfactory bulb, their smelling mechanism, maps to the part of their brain that we use to see with, to the occipital cortex. And so, the theory is the dogs can actually see smells. When they're traveling around, they can map smells in ways that are unimaginable to us. They just found that dinosaurs and apparently some birds still have vestigial parts of this, have a whole set of little tiny holes with sensors in their beaks or in the front of their mouths that are apparently so sensitive, and some birds still have this, apparently, the birds that eat clams along the seashore, that are so sensitive at detecting motion under the ground, again, something that we could never do, that they can just stick their nose right down into the ground and pull up a worm or a clam. I think everybody has, we used to always think that there were 5 senses. Then some, smart wag came along and said, well, what about the vestibular system? The inner ear. It measures gravity. We all have a gravitometer in us. So we actually have a sensory, and it's why we can stand up straight. And so we all have a gravity sensory system. So that makes 6. And are you suggesting that what is at work here is another sensory system that we're just not familiar with, we don't customarily use, or that in many people it has atrophied?
Hey, Tom, would you like a job in my lab? That's exactly the right question. The answer is yes. And actually, there are more sensory systems of the kind. We can do echolocation and some pretty bizarre things, detect magnetic fields of the normal variety in our brain. And so I'm proposing, and my colleagues do also, that, we're dealing with yet again another sensory system.
Well, I've known for years that I'm extraordinarily good with directions. You can put me pretty much anywhere. I lived a summer, my friend Clark Stinson and I hauled a couple of teepees, a 3-day hike up into the Chippewa National Forest in northern Michigan. And we're literally in the middle of nowhere. And we spent the summer there doing what we thought was spiritual practice. But I could always find my way in and out of anywhere. I have just this thing. I have an internal compass, and I know people like it. My father was like that. My wife, on the other hand, nothing there. Doesn't. If you said which way is north, she'd have to look at the sky, and I didn't need to look at the sky. I can do them in the middle of the night. So I'm assuming, and we know now this is how birds migrate. This is how insects migrate. This is built into lots and lots of animals, and apparently some little fragment of it is still built into us. So what's the mechanism of this sensory system that you're suggesting?
Don't know exactly. That's clearly a big issue. One of the other big issues that we have, the people who can do this under laboratory conditions don't know when they can do it or when it's happening. Give an example here. We have a complicated experiment, and one of the so-called psychics is coming to the lab, and they park in the parking lot, and everything psychic that's going to happen to them happens at that point, not when they come into the laboratory and get wired for EEG or whatever things we're measuring. And that's extremely frustrating because these people don't know when they're psychic.
Do they get the information before it's, quote, sent?
Yes.
Are we having time distortions here, too?
Something like that, sure. I'll give you an example of how frustrating it can be. If we humans had access to all space and all time, all at once, and were cognitively aware of, I'll use a technical term, we'd all go bull goose loony in a heartbeat. We have to be able to slow down that, or
filter,
winnow out the bad stuff. You do that visually and auditory. You go to a restaurant having a nice conversation with somebody, and somebody drops a big tray of dishes. You learn to ignore that and continue the conversation. So one of the big pressing issues of our research right now is say, hey, what opens that door to this vast array of information over space and time? And more importantly, what closes it? We don't have much of a clue on either of those, and it's really quite frustrating to the researchers.
3 times in the since COVID started, and this has happened to me many times throughout my life, but it seems to be happening with increasing frequency. I will suddenly think of somebody that I literally, in one case it was somebody that I knew from childhood, that I literally hadn't thought of since I was probably 12 years old, somebody I knew when I was 8 or 9 years old. Another one was a person that I was friends with for maybe 6 months back in the late 60s. And a third one was a person that I had met while traveling in the 80s and, got to know for a few weeks in semi-social situations. And again, none of these three people had I even thought about once in probably 20 years. And they would just pop into my mind. And in all three cases, now that's not to say these are the only people who popped into my mind, but in all three cases, within 48 hours, those people reached out to me. I didn't reach out to them. And, hey, I found your email on the internet. It's been a long time. How are you? And is this a common thing?
Yes, very
Is
common.
this part of this?
Yes. Well, there are other reasons too, but certainly ESP might be a component of that. I'm not going to say that every experience we humans have is always mediated by some extrasensory perception, but there are two possible ways that can happen. One is you had a telepathic view, you got that information, or maybe you dreamt about it. ESP happens a lot in dreams. There was a big laboratory in Brooklyn for years about dream telepathy, but what may happen, you've got that through telepathic means, whatever that happens to be, or the people in your future contacting you, and you had access to that future information. How's that?
That's even weirder. This is really weird stuff. Funded for 20 years by the U.S. government. I want to find out why the government stopped funding it and what they had to say about that and what other things you learned. We're talking with Dr. Edwin C. May, a nuclear physicist, the founder and director of the Laboratories for Fundamental Research, IFR.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann program. Call 202-808-9925.
Why is the U.S. government doing ESP research for spying, and what came out of it? Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. From 1975 until 1995, for 20 years, the U.S. federal government, our federal government, via the CIA, sponsored a program to collect intelligence, not just to do the experiments and things, but actually to spy on the Soviet Union using so-called psychics. And the program, has nothing to do with the crazy nonsense you see online. This was a serious program. The unclassified name was Stargate. I just tweeted a book that has the declassified, work of this group. I just tweeted that out just a moment ago. There are 89,000 pages in this document that was declassified by the CIA in 2003. It's been published in 4 volumes in this work, and the foreword for this was written by former Republican senator from Maine and then Bill Clinton Defense Secretary William Cohen, who knew about the program and expressed its value. This is not, we're not having a theoretical conversation here about airy-fairy stuff. This is serious stuff. The Defense Intelligence Agency, the Central Intelligence Agency, the National Security Engagement, 19 military and intelligence units in the federal government were involved in 504 separate intelligence missions using this program. And one of the people who helped put it together and run it for 20 years, Dr. Edwin C. May, is on the line with us, a nuclear physicist. He's the founder and director of the Laboratories for Fundamental Research. Dr. May, just to recap real quickly, when this program was ended in 1995, why was it ended? Oh, Dr. May, I'm sorry. I forgot to put you back on the air. My bad. You're back on the air now. I'm sorry.
Okay. It's a good question. And when I first started thinking about that seriously, Senator Cohen had asked me to write a piece complaining about what the CIA did. In the 1995 budget for the intelligence and military community, there was a piece in there that said that the CIA should take over the program from the Defense Intelligence Agency, which is where it resides, if they did a 20-year evaluation of the program and found it to be useful. Well, they said in their report, no, even though ESP is probably real, it was never ever useful. And I thought, well, wait a minute, hold on, that's not true. The CIA, came at us with 43 separate missions to do spying and so on. So years later, it wasn't until last year when I was reading some of the released documents that appear in Volume 4 of that set, where the truth came out, that the Cold War was over. There was budget reduction in Congress for spying on anybody because the Cold War was over, and then we have a memo which is published from the CIA, from Congress to the CIA, threatening them that if they don't slim down their large number of small programs, that they might even shut down the CIA from the get-go. And I was shocked to see that, but that's the main reason they shut it off.
I can imagine, if I was a senator and I had oversight over the CIA's budget, and I thought the CIA was doing crackpot research into ESP, saying, hey, quit wasting money. I get that. And I can imagine maybe some senators saying, hey, if this stuff is true and it really works, this could be a dangerous Pandora's box that we don't want to open, although that kind of ignores the fact that other countries are doing the same kind of research. What do you think was the essential motivation for that threat to the CIA that ended this program? And do you have any knowledge that similar programs have been revived since then, or are we now, so deeply into the internet age that it's much easier to spy on people simply by intercepting their emails?
I argue with my colleagues about that. I do not think, but I hope I'm wrong here, that elements within our government are doing this anymore. And it turns out to be a sociological issue more than anything. I spent a decade with my colleagues after the program was formally closed to try to restart it, given the era of terrorism. I've even tried to do joint forces with former adversaries in Russia, the ex-KGB guys, who I'm now quite friendly with. They wanted a joint program with our program to work the issues of counterterrorism, and that was turned down by us, by the U.S.
Wow. If I correctly understood what you said earlier, which is that you've got one guy sitting in New York City, and he is in 20 minutes when the guy in Los Angeles arrives at the laboratory and steps into the Faraday shield or whatever, steps into the laboratory and starts trying to read the mind of the guy in New York. At that point, the guy in New York is going to pull a card out with a picture on it, and it's got a number on the back, and he's just going to see the number, and the guy in Los Angeles is going to be able to describe the picture. That as that guy in Los Angeles is pulling into the parking lot of the building, and the guy in New York has not yet pulled the random card from the stack, the guy in Los Angeles already knows what the picture is going to be. If I'm accurately redescribing what I thought I heard you say in the last half hour, that calls into question our understanding of time as well as space. I mean, is this consistent or inconsistent with Albert Einstein's notions of time and space, or am I completely mischaracterizing what you said?
No, you did it exactly right. We conducted one really bizarre experiment the moon of Jupiter the innermost moon of Jupiter goes around Jupiter every 3 hours, and unlike our moon, they have a lunar eclipse on Jupiter. If you were sitting there watching it, you would see the thing. And we had people here try to determine when that time where the moon on Jupiter was half lit. That was what we were looking for. and our people could get that time to plus or minus 10 seconds of the actual time. Now, the question is, did they do that before the light came back to Earth? It took 40 minutes to do that.
That is faster than the speed of light, isn't it, for a distance to Jupiter, or maybe not? I don't know how far away Jupiter is.
Well, the question was,
light travels 186,000 miles a second, right?
Yeah, it was 40 light minutes take 40 minutes for the light to propagate here. So the question is, did they do it when our telescopes here were measuring it, or did they do it while at Jupiter time? The answer is, I'm sorry to tell you, it was as if our remote viewing participants were sitting on Jupiter. They did it in the Jupiter time frame.
So this blows up the idea that time and space are just linear continuums.
If that's the case, now I'll tell you the same problem we had about the telepathy thing. Did the remote viewer or the participant in the experiment get the data from the actual moon as it went around Jupiter, or did that person look into their future when we told them how well they did from the telescope imagery? We have yet to figure out a way to separate those two things out.
Wow. Now,
a giant pain, I'll tell you.
Yeah. John Quimby wrote a book back in the mid-1800s that Mary Baker Eddy largely plagiarized and created this thing called Christian Science. And in Christian Science, a religion for which actually I have a lot of respect, I've known a number of Christian scientists throughout my life, and, people ask for prayer from total strangers. They ask for prayer from other Christian scientists, and people sit down and in a fairly methodical way pray for them, typically for things like physical and mental health. And you've got an entire religion here that's lasted 150 years that asserts that this is true. And I know that there was a Harvard study that suggested that it was true, that it did work, and then there was another study that sought to debunk that. We have about a minute before we hit a break here. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, there have actually been some very careful studies about the role of intercessory prayer affecting somebody at a distance. Now, if I'm going to heal you right in front of you, that doesn't count because I can, putting hands on you for healing. But no, if I'm in LA and you're in Portland, is there a way I can use prayer to affect your physical health? Well, there's a secondary aspect. The answer appears not to be the case. I don't believe that's the case from hard science. There's another explanation for the observable.
Okay. So, which makes sense. I mean, health is such a huge and complex system, whereas we're talking about a very, very delicate, just catching a fragment of a thought here, are we not?
Yeah, and we ignored healing throughout the entire Stargate era because it is such a difficult issue. What constitutes getting better and what's not? How much is the individual responsible for their own health and so on? And so we said, hey, we got something else to worry about. Let's not do that.
Yeah, this is remarkable. I think we're in a break, Sean. Yeah, there we go. There's the music. We're talking with Dr. Edwin May. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
Stick around. Nuclear physicist Dr. Edwin May, the founder and director of the Laboratories for Fundamental Research, is with us about a project that the CIA ran for 20 years. Welcome back. We're talking with Dr. Edwin C. May, a nuclear physicist who is the director of the Laboratories for Fundamental Research right now, and back from 75 to 95 was working with and for the CIA and the Department of Defense on a study of PSI, of psychic phenomena. Dr. May, you mentioned the question why when we were talking during the break. Let me just give you run of the show here. What did you mean, and where do you want to go with that?
Well, people always ask me, why do I think this is a genuine phenomenon? Why does the government think that? And sure, I could go off the geeky cliff and start quoting statistics and all that and put your listening audience to sleep. A better question. Tom, let's suppose you were going to open up a restaurant in Portland, and you have the best chef in Oregon, and it's a small little place that only seats 19 people, and you have a great menu and a wine cellar, blah, blah, blah. On opening night, 19 people come and fill up your restaurant. And then for the next week or two, 17 of those original 19 customers are coming back. what would you conclude about the quality of your restaurant? What would it? I mean,
People think it's great.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. Well, now, as you said earlier, we had 19 customers for spying. The usual suspects, the CIA, Defense Intelligence Agency, the Secret Service, the NSA, and so on. Of those 19 customers who came, 17 of them returned with new and fresh spying missions. They wouldn't do that if this weren't real. That's what convinces me, and it also convinced the government. But, Tom, I'd like to correct one thing, though. The CIA quit funding our program in 1975. The massive amount of funding we had was from the Defense Intelligence Agency and the Medical Research and Development Command of the United States Army.
I see. Okay.
They were the biggest funders.
What does this tell us, or is it even reasonable to try to draw conclusions from this other than that, hey, there's something here, we should be looking at this again, and is anybody doing that? And then, well, let's start with that.
Yes. I'm working now with a group of neuroscientists, young neuroscientists. I'm getting old. It's time for some young people to take over. And they are committed to understanding what is going on in the brain from someone who can do this under laboratory conditions compared to someone who can't do it at all under laboratory conditions. That will teach us something about the brain we currently don't understand. Also, how that information gets from India tomorrow to today here, that's something else that maybe we'll learn something about space and time. But those probably, it's going to be 20, 50 years from now.
In your opinion, I mean, given that you've conducted thousands of these experiments and hundreds of spying missions on behalf of 19 different U.S. federal agencies, do you think that the people who are particularly good, that what separates people who are particularly good from this from people who are particularly bad at it, or like Louise and I with regard to directionality and presumably magnetism, because we know now that there are actually cells that have a lot of iron that can, react to the Earth's magnetic field, and the birds, make use of that and whatnot. Do you think that it's that we all have the ability, and some of us have encouraged and built it? I mean, when I was a kid, my mom got me into praying for other people, and I literally, I think every day of my life since I was a teenager, I try to pray for somebody, because I think there's something there. Is that developing this sense, or is it that some people just don't have it, that they might be lacking an organ or a type of cell or something?
Well, as I said earlier, I'm lazy. If I don't have to invent something new, I won't. And if you look at all other human capacity, there are some people that can play, a piano for Carnegie Hall, and other people can only do chopsticks. You can train me forever to play tennis, and I will never be able to play at Wimbledon. So the question is, and we've looked at it, about 1% of the population can exhibit this phenomena under laboratory conditions. And that sounds like a small amount, but my gosh, if you multiply that by the people on the Earth, there are a lot of people who can do this. But not everybody can, because not everybody can run a 4-minute mile. Not everybody can jump 6 feet in the high jump. So it's not a surprise that it's winnowed down. We have some idea. Have you heard of the concept called synesthesia? Have you heard of that concept?
Yes, it's where you confuse senses. You taste sight, or colors, or you smell what you touch, right?
We think our best people are what are called synesthetes, that have that ability in their heads, and you can look at the functional MRI pictures of their brain, and they're getting crosstalk among the various sensory parts of the brain.
Okay, so when I was a teenager, I took LSD, and I experienced that. I experienced synesthesia. Is this, it's just kind of your senses getting scrambled. Is this something that could be induced with a substance like LSD?
There is a guy in the UK that's been examining that for a very long time. I joined you back in the 60s on a similar situation. But it turns out that those, and shamans throughout history have said, well, peyote and other magic mushrooms and so on what that does is create a marvelous internal experience in your brain. I mean, it's really lovely sometimes and terrifying at others, but that's in your brain. It actually gets in the way of information coming from some external source by ESP to get into your brain. It becomes a noise, a discrimination problem. You know, somebody
Right,
whispering to you in a crowded restaurant, you can't understand what they're talking about. Too much noise.
Right. Oh, that makes perfect sense. And because I mean, Tim Leary back in the day speculated about this, that LSD might be the thing that proved psychic abilities. But you think that it actually interferes with the process?
Actually, there's more than just think about it. A guy named David Luke at Greenwich College in England has done extensive work in various countries around the world. He can't do it here because the substances are controlled, and he found that it gets in the way.
It gets in the way. Fascinating stuff. Thanks so much for dropping by and talking with us, Dr. May. Dr. Edwin C. May, the founder and director of the Laboratories for Fundamental Research, LFR.org. It's been fascinating. Thanks so much for dropping by.
Well, it's been my pleasure, Tom. Thank you very much.
Mine too. We will be back in just a moment. Stick around. We're going to get back into economics and politics.